just had a heart attack. I wanted their opinion.
Of course.
I wanted to know what they thought. Even if I disagreed with it, I wanted all the information I could get. And they just didn't even want to have conversations with me about, the information that I had. They just told me this is what you have to do. And if you don't do this, you're going to have heart failure. Atherosclerosis is clotting tissue. Heart attack is clotting tissue. Stroke is clotting tissue. Why does the body initiate clots? Why does the body initiate clots?
Today, we're going to talk about your heart and how you can protect your heart. And that's because all of us, we want to live a very long, healthy, successful life filled with love. For that love, we need our hearts to function well. And we're going to focus on some practical tips. What can we do every day to actually protect the heart and make sure it functions well? It's very important because a lot of people in today's healthcare system complain and they say, we have a big problem. And I agree with them. We do have a big problem. Healthcare system is typically treating more of like symptoms versus the cause. A lot of people complain about that. And while there are some things in the system that I agree that needs to be improved, I want to focus on what can we do that is actually within our control, within your control. If you've been following our doctors networking group, you know that a lot of people go from doctor to doctor, follow recommendations, and still don't feel better. It's like a cycle that never ends. What I believe is integrative healthcare can help a lot. That's really the way to practice medicine. And while a lot of people complain about different disciplines, what I want to do is just do my little part to bring people together. Sometimes you find somebody who is very, very interesting. And that's why I'm extremely excited to bring our guest today to you. He is trained as a chiropractor. He is also a functional medicine doctor, health coach, who has a personal story that is very inspiring. It wasn't easy for him, and then all the trial and error, all the heavy research, he packages and he actually delivers to people through his content. And I'm very excited to bring his knowledge and his experience to you because possibly he can move the needle in your life or in somebody who you love. He wrote 2 books, and I want him to talk about these books today. Sometimes all it takes is just one tip to motivate, give hope, and move you to the right direction. I'm very happy to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Hussey. Dr. Hussey, welcome to Polish Your Life.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Where do we start? Because it's a wealth of knowledge that you have, and I want people to understand the context. If you don't mind, maybe share a little bit about your story so people can understand where the passion is coming from.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, like from a very young age, like even the age of 2, I struggled with what I guess I would call inflammatory conditions, or what medicine calls inflammatory conditions. So everything from allergies and asthma to I used to break out in hives all over my body, like ginormous hives all over my body, and the doctors couldn't tell me why. I had irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel syndrome as well, and I also ended up with type 1 diabetes, which, the theory is that's autoimmune in nature. One theory anyways. And so that, all that stuff kind of threw my parents and I into the world of Western medicine, trying to help manage these conditions. And, that was the key word, is that they managed them, but no one could tell me why they were there or how to get rid of them. And so, my entire childhood, I was told that as a type 1 diabetic, I'm heavily predisposed to heart disease. And that would likely be what I have to look out for as I grew up. So then, it wasn't until college that I realized that the way I lived my life had a direct impact on my ability to, quote unquote, manage these conditions. And ultimately, through lifestyle change, I got rid of all of them, aside from the type 1 diabetes that was kind of collateral damage from that inflammation. But yeah, I got rid of all of that. So I found it interesting that no physician had ever told me that I could change my lifestyle and that these things would go away. And so that kind of, propelled me into this, quest to understand how I made them go away by changing lifestyle and just to health in general. So every time, because of my predisposition to heart disease, every time I heard about heart disease, my ears perked up and I learned a lot. And at first it was very traditional understandings of heart disease. But then I, would read more obscure things and things on the fringe, and just read everything I could. And a lot of what I was reading There seemed to be a lot of evidence against the mainstream understanding of what the heart is, what it does, what causes heart disease. And so I had all this information. And then, I'd always been kind of health conscious, since at least since college and managing my health. And then to my surprise and to everyone else's surprise around me, at the age of 34, I actually had a heart attack, despite my best efforts. And so, a massive heart attack, a widowmaker heart attack. I had 100% blockage of my left anterior descending artery.
Wow.
But there were some curious things about it because there was no atherosclerosis in my arteries. When they did the angiogram, there was just a giant clot that formed. And so that further propelled me into researching heart disease and heart attacks and how this happened, like what happened to me and why did it happen. And it's led me to an understanding of why this happened and why it happens in other people as well that is completely different, I think, than the traditional understanding of what heart disease is and how it occurs and how completely off base we are, as a society, especially within modern medicine, about the causes of heart disease and how to prevent it. And so it's kind of my mission now to help spread the information, so that we can all make more informed decisions and share the information and help other people and kind of learn from my story and learn from my maybe obsessive research about the topic, and figure out how to best move forward.
First of all, thank you for sharing. And that's a unfortunate situation turned into something that is very positive for a lot of people. So having a heart attack without the typical reason that you would think would be behind it, and then you find out what exactly do you find out? What was the reason? Because that's what a lot of people listening to this will say, okay, why did he have a heart attack if he didn't have the problems that you would suspect would cause one?
Yeah. So yeah, I'd always been very diet centered. I ate a very whole foods diet. Ate
Even
a
before, right?
Yeah, even before this. Yeah, well before it. And so everybody talks about diet when it comes to heart disease because of this cholesterol theory. It's so focused on cholesterol and lipids, and to me, it's just a giant distraction from what we should actually be talking about when it comes to heart disease. And so I had been very, diligent about diet, and less about other things. And so, you know, in uh, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn, says things like, there's things wrong with the question. Like if the question is not answered by the usual theory, or if we reject one theory, then we don't replace it with another one, then we're rejecting science itself. So like if I reject the cholesterol theory, but I don't replace it with something else,
Right.
then I've missed something, right? And so
What
that's,
do
I
you
think,
what do
was
you
my
replace it
mistake.
with?
Yeah, right, exactly. And so that's what I started looking for. And so when you look at heart attacks, strokes, atherosclerosis, or plaque forming in the arteries, it's all the result of clotting tissue, clots forming in arteries, whether it's a low grade clot formation over time, which develops an atherosclerosis or narrowing of an artery, which can happen in more than coronary arteries, or if it's the end stage result of heart attack, stroke, like a clot forms. And so there are theories that cholesterol does that, or leads to stenosis of an artery, and that causes plaque rupture, and that leads to a clot and things like that. But there's really not much backing up that theory. It is just that, a theory. And if you look at atherosclerotic buildup, it's clotting tissue, right? It's like 87% plus or minus clotting tissue, according to one study, when you analyze plaque. So there's very little, if any, cholesterol present. And so the thing is that it's clotting. That's what happened to me. A clot formed, right? A giant clot formed that was big enough to entirely block my left anterior descending artery. I had no atherosclerotic plaque, like newly formed soft plaque, so to speak. When they did the angiogram, there was none there. Just a giant clot formed. And I had a CAC score, which is a measure of calcification of a coronary artery, through a CT scan, 6 months prior to my heart attack, and it was zero. There was no calcification of arteries.
Wow.
And still had this event. So, you know, things that cause clotting, there are many things that can cause it. Like Rudolf Virchow, in 1856, found that the things that cause clotting in a blood vessel, are when there's damage to the lining of the artery, when there's poor or stagnant blood flow, and when elements of blood, like red blood cells, get too sticky, they stick together too much. Those things can predispose us to clotting. And so there are many things that can cause that issue. So for me personally, what was going on in my life was the 6 months prior to the heart attack. It was a very stressful 6 months for me. I let a lot of things get to me that I probably shouldn't have. It was during COVID, and there's a lot of things I disagreed with that were going on that I probably got too caught up in. But then a day and a half prior to the heart attack, I got some very stressful news about a close family member. Probably some of the most stressful news I've ever heard in my life. And it wasn't just that I got the news, it was the inability of me or my family to do anything about it. We were just sitting there waiting, hoping this situation would resolve, which was very, very stressful. And so a day and a half later, I had a heart attack. But there were other things too. I think that at the time I was pretty dehydrated. I was not paying attention to hydration, which, if we're looking at flow of things, and the hydraulic system or the hydraulic nature of the vessels, that's not a good thing to have less fluid in the system. So that was a component. And then I think unwisely, what triggered the whole thing was in that state of stress and dehydration and just being type 1 diabetic and having blood sugars that aren't as normal, no matter how hard I try, as someone who's not type 1 diabetic. I think that I unwisely did a workout that morning in that state of stress, my usual workout, which is usually very intense, high intensity interval training. And I've actually found evidence that type 1s don't handle that as well, especially in a state of stress because of autonomic imbalance. And it caused enough of an inflammatory response in arteries that are under more pressure anyways, like the coronary arteries, and a clot formed. Because 15 minutes after I did that workout, clot formed. As soon as my blood slowed down from the workout, it clotted in that area. And I was fortunate that, I got to the emergency room and they were able to, bust the clot with enzymes and place a stent. And I'm grateful for Western medicine for that.
Of course,
Obviously, in an emergency, that's the best place you can be.
of course.
But after the fact, the care that I received in the hospital, those 3 days when I was in the hospital, were pretty abysmal, and were not in accordance with what the research reflects. It's very clear that Western medicine has been somewhat hijacked by industry, whether it's pharmaceutical industry or food industry. I couldn't believe the food I was being served or the food that I was recommended to eat for heart disease. I was prescribed 11 different medications, most of which I did not need. And so it kind of reinvigorated me because I was pretty dejected at this point, after this happening. Felt that I was a hypocrite, but seeing the shortcomings of the advice I was receiving, it kind of reinvigorated me and said, I at least have to share the information that I know so that people can make educated decisions, so that we can start the conversation, right? And actually have a conversation about this, because that was the most troubling thing in the hospital, is that when I tried to bring up different things to physicians, they would shut down the conversation. They wouldn't even want to talk about it. And it wasn't me at that time being argumentative. I just had a heart attack. I wanted their opinion.
Of course.
And I wanted to know what they thought. Even if I disagreed with it, I wanted all the information I could get. And they just didn't even want to have conversations with me about, the information that I had. They just told me, this is what you have to do. And if you don't do this, you're going to have heart failure. That was pretty much the message I got. And so yeah, that's what caused it. That's how I've, gotten to where I am. And I'm happy to say my heart's completely recovered, 100%
Amazing.
recovered,
Amazing.
despite doing almost nothing of what they recommended. I did my own protocols once I got home, and my heart's doing fine. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, a lot to learn from this, and a lot of things that I've found since then. But yeah, that's kind of the story.
Wow. Unbelievable story. And I'm trying to look at it multidimensionally. So one, I'm really thinking about that person who had a heart attack, you being in that situation and trying to understand how you felt and also what was going through your mind. Did you already have the depth of the knowledge that was enough for you to like have the control over like I know what I want to do, or you just have a sense like, hey, this just doesn't make sense? Where were you in your mind space then?
Yeah, I had the knowledge at that time. I had enough knowledge to know to question the recommendations they were giving me. And as much as I knew about that, experiencing it firsthand was different.
Of course.
And
No, of
now
course.
I can relate to people in that situation for sure. So I knew enough to doubt those things, and I knew enough to know that I was going to definitely do my own thing outside. The only thing I did that they recommended was a blood thinner for 6 months. That's the only thing because I had a stent in there,
Right.
didn't until my body incorporated that into the vessel wall. Like I did that to prevent any future sort of clotting or anything. What I didn't understand fully is why it happened to me and why what happened. And so I do think I fully understand that now, though
Okay.
it's just theories. I mean, it'd always be theories. No one will ever be able to tell me exactly what happened. And clearly they couldn't at the hospital because when I asked them, they just said, "Oh, your cholesterol. Oh, that's what it is. Cholesterol. Cholesterol does it, right?" And so that was the one line answer they gave me. But I do think I understand now, based on what I was telling you, it's clotting, and we can go into all the mechanisms of clotting and how that happens, if you like. But yeah, at first when I was there, it was really just an understanding of I guess a hesitancy and a skepticism of those things. I mean, clearly, if that's the standard of care that everybody is getting, it's not working because heart disease continues to be the number one killer in the world. And especially in places like the United States and the UK, where Western medicine is pretty entrenched. And so clearly it's just not working. So there must be something else. There must be other answers, and that's what I've tried to find.
Yeah. And I think the power is in asking the right questions, like you
Mm,
mentioned. And what I like to pair it with is also action, right? What can be done instead of just talking about concepts, because it's easy to say, well, this is wrong, this is not it, this is not it, this is not it, this doesn't matter. So what actually does matter? What is it that I
mm.
can actually do? And then I would like to get to these points. And of course, I'm interested in knowing more about clotting, like you mentioned, the mechanisms, how it forms, because when we talk about protecting the heart in this interview, how do you protect it? If that was the reason for the heart attack, there is at least one solid theory that you have about that. Why don't we at least find out what you think about preventing that? I also wanted to touch on the second kind of like parallel. So, one, I was curious about your mindset. The other parallel was I'm thinking about a person who is watching or listening to this interview. We're not giving you any medical advice with this. A lot of things will sound like, okay, now I know exactly what to do. Verify everything, do your own research. But I'm telling you that there is definitely something wrong in the healthcare system, that it's the call to action from, I think, both of us, and you can confirm, is always ask why, verify the information instead of blindly following advice. And I want people to really pay attention to this, because it's not our job to tell you what to do. It's your body. You can decide. But by the way, it's your body. You can decide. Let me repeat it. Your doctor doesn't decide what you will do. It's your decision. Let me know if you agree with this, that, patients are in charge. We always should verify. And what is your kind of like general recommendation if people ask you, what should I do?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my job, I as a practitioner, and when I do like my online consulting and stuff, is to give people information. That's all I can really do. They make the decisions, and that's what I see the role of a doctor is. You can make a recommendation, you can give information, but it's the patient's decision. And in my situation, based on the research that I've done, the information that I had, I was able to make decisions based on me and what I wanted to do. But those were my decisions and solely my decisions because of the information that I had. So people should do whatever makes them feel best. And yeah, like what we're saying is in no way medical advice. It's just information. People can do with it what they want. But if you're dealing with medical therapies and things, always consult your physician and then make your decision. That's how it works.
Yeah. And you know what's uh, very optimistic in all this is a situation that is negative that can be turned into a positive is a typical situation where somebody blames their doctor for them not getting better. And I see it all the time. And, sometimes it's not your doctor. Maybe you have the wrong doctor. Maybe your doctor had a bad day, gave you the wrong advice. Maybe there was not enough testing, not enough information. There's so much that we as patients can control when we are in a situation like this. And even if you're watching this and maybe you're like, hey, I'm not Dr. Hussey, I'm not Mike, I'm not really in this space. I don't want to do all the research and I'm not really that interested until something happens. You can hire somebody. You can have somebody within your circles, a health coach. You can have somebody who's going to support you, be a patient advocate who actually is a little bit deeper in that space. But I want to definitely empower people because it's very optimistic from my point of view that we actually are in much more control than we think. we receive a medical advice or a health advice from somebody, or just not advice, but a recommendation, or even one level less, just information, not even recommendation, right? What do you do with that information is always up to you. But the easy way out for people, and I think sometimes it's the mistake that people make, including any condition, is that they're like, my doctor sucks, or like the
Hmm.
system sucks. Well, we can look in the mirror and say, what can I do to understand it better? So let's understand it better. Let's understand the mechanism. Clotting, right? If this is one of the major theories for like, hey, that can cause a widowmaker heart attack, major problem. What's the mechanism of forming that clotting that you discovered in your research?
Yeah, so here's the information as I know it, right? Um, or as I've found in the literature. Um, so so yeah, like I talked about before, atherosclerosis is clotting tissue. Heart attack is clotting tissue. Stroke is clotting tissue. Sometimes it happens more acutely, and we get more of an event sort of thing. And sometimes it happens chronically, slowly, and that's more gradual buildup of plaque and stuff like that. But it's clotting tissue. So why does the body initiate clots? Usually to stop bleeding or to repair damage temporarily, right? So if you cut your skin externally, a clot will form, a scab forms that stops the bleeding until the body can heal that tissue. And so the same thing happens on the lining of the artery. If there's damage and the body can't repair it fast enough, or if it's so much damage that it's overwhelmed, the body starts to deposit clotting tissue to prevent a rupture of the vessel, pretty much, or excessive bleeding of the vessel. Um, or if it happens so acutely, this damage or this increase in inflammation and clotting signaling happens so acutely, it can result in a very large clot that forms. And that's what happened in my case. I triggered that. The end game of that was I triggered it with that inflammatory exercise. Exercise is a hormetic stress that triggers inflammation, is good for you in the long term. But done at the wrong time, I feel like if someone's in that state, it can result in bad things. I'm not trying to scare people with exercise or whatever, but that seems to be what happened in my case. Um, so yeah, so there are many things that can cause clotting. Acute stress is one of them. All the clotting factors go up when you're acutely stressed. All the clotting factors in the blood. You could have toxin exposure. You could have poor metabolic health, leading to insulin resistance, which impairs the ability of the lining of the artery to repair itself. And all those things you can have endotoxemia, which is poor gut or dental health, where there's endotoxic bacteria leaking to the bloodstream when it shouldn't be. There's lots of different things that can cause this damage. And so if we get to a situation where the damage happens, the body, if it's small enough, will deposit some clotting tissue there. And there may be some cholesterol present in that, but it's no more than enough that was floating around whenever the clot formed and got stuck in the clot. And again, there's literature that shows that when they analyze atherosclerosis, there's very little cholesterol and it's mostly clotting tissue. And just debris from damage in general. There's white blood cells and what they call pultaceous debris in the study. So yeah. Now, if that happens gradually over time, okay, then it can create this narrowing of the artery, narrowing or stenosis of the artery. And so the theory is that gradually that narrows, and over time it can narrow enough that it restricts blood flow, and people can get things like angina, or they can get a heart attack, or a piece of it can rupture or break off and a clot can form. However, there's lots of evidence against that idea. So we can get this narrowing of an artery. And the research of this guy named Giorgio Beraldi, who was kind of shunned in his field because he was coming up with this alternative theory, and it totally throws the things on its head. They kind of just ignored him. Shows that anytime the stenosis, the gradual narrowing of the artery, gets to about 60-70% narrowed, the body starts building collateral arteries around the stenosis, the narrowing of the artery, just bypassing it altogether. And he showed in his research that this happens 100% of the time. But sometimes it happens robustly enough that someone could still run a marathon. And we have case studies of
Wow.
people with a 90% blockage running a marathon. And it's because they have these collaterals. But then some people, they don't form as well. And it's always enough to keep them alive, but they may still have some symptoms because it's not as well formed collaterals. But Beraldi showed that it happens in everyone to build the collaterals around it.
Amazing. Very
Yeah, it's
optimistic too.
yeah, right. And so I've been told by some cardiologists that, oh yeah, some people have collateral, some people don't. But
But
Beraldi's
you said
research shows that,
100%. His
yeah,
studies show 100%. So some people do and some people don't. If it's a long period of time, according to that study, it's 100% that you will have it, right?
yeah. And I think based on some other literature that I found, it seems to be based on how active the person is. If the person's more active, there'll be more robust collaterals.
Makes sense.
If they're less active, it seems
Mhm.
that they'll have less robust collaterals. But
Makes
it
sense because less
always
is needed, right? To keep them, functioning at
Yeah,
the
yeah. And
normally.
also blood flow in general seems to be what triggers angiogenesis, which is the formation of new blood vessels. So when we get things flowing more, like when we're more active, then it seems to trigger the formation of them more. Those collaterals explain why, when you look at the long-term studies on elective stent placements, so stents, like if someone gets an angiogram, just checking things out, they go in and say, oh, you got a 50% narrowing right there. We're going to place a stent. There's no heart attack happening. It's just we're going to go in and place a stent there to prevent one from happening. Um, they do that, or if they do bypass surgeries where they go and they take a vein out of somewhere else and they bypass the blockage or the stenosis altogether. If you look at the long-term studies on those procedures, and I haven't been able to find one that says otherwise, they don't work. Like whether or not you have the procedure or you don't have it, you're like just as likely to have a heart attack. So they're not preventing
Wow.
future events. Sometimes they do relieve angina in people. They relieve chest pain, but there's theories that it's because they interfere with nerves and they cut nerves during the procedures, so they may not feel it anymore. So there's just evidence that those things aren't the most effective way, and it makes sense because if the body's already built collaterals around it, opening up the artery or bypassing it again isn't really going to make a difference, right? We haven't affected why the clotting is happening. We're just trying to restore blood flow or something, but we're not addressing the underlying cause.
That's overall
Now,
very optimistic what you're saying.
yeah,
Even though the standard of care and the logical simplification of this explain to the patient, say, hey, you have a certain percent of narrowing to prevent it. We're going to put a stent there. So that's oversimplification of the situation. Actually, should always be paired up with the information that optimistic of information that you mentioned is that, hey, by the way, Mr. or Mrs. Patient, we actually have that collateral formation of blood vessels there to help out. Why not everybody talks about this? Because that's a very important piece of information, including the decision that you, as a patient, need to make. Are we placing a stent or are we not? If you had that additional piece of information that there is another way for the blood to get to the heart, would you do it or would you not? But I think it's good to have that information, right?
right. And it's also good to have the information of, again, if I reject the paradigm that a stent's going to help me prevent a heart attack, I have to replace it with something else. I have to do so. It's not like I just say, oh, no, I don't want to do that. I have to fix the things that may predispose me to clotting, which we'll get to. But the other side of this theory is that, the quote unquote soft plaque is more vulnerable and that it will rupture or break off, and that causes a clot to form, and that's what causes heart attacks. However, there was a paper published in 2015 that reviewed all the evidence for this theory that plaque rupture causes heart attacks. And what they concluded, and these are the numbers, is that plaque ruptures do happen, but they only result in heart attacks 0.06% of the time, which is essentially zero. I mean,
Yeah, that's
0.06, right?
probably, within the margin of error.
Right, exactly. And so and in the paper they put a lot of emphasis. If you read that paper, it's called The Myth of the Vulnerable Plaque. You can look it up, it's free to read. If and they put so much emphasis and back it up with literature showing that we should be focusing on clotting tissue or thrombotic events like thrombosis. That's what we should be talking about in that paper. That's what they say. Because, if you get a clot forming, if you have a 50% narrowing of your artery and you get a clot, a smaller clot is going to block that. So that is relevant. That stenosis is relevant that in that sense. But in my case, I had zero
Right.
atherosclerosis and a clot just formed that was big enough to block it. So we want to focus on things that decrease clotting. And so that's what I want to explain now. is how do we decrease clotting, right? So to explain this, I have to explain what's called structured water. So structured water, like we're a large percentage water. Our body is made up of water. The blood is about half water. But water actually holds some very unique properties. And there are scientists going back the last century and a half that have been discovering this and talking about this. Everybody from Gilbert Ling to Mei-Wan Ho to James Clegg, Jim Oshman, and then most recently Gerald Pollack have been talking about this structured water or fourth phase water or exclusion zone water. And what it is that water is unique in that it can hold energy. And when it holds energy, and it gets next to a water loving surface, which all biological surfaces are water loving, then it will structure itself into something that's not quite solid, not quite liquid. It's more like a gel. Okay, so it's not ice, it's not water, it's more like gel, like a jello or like the consistency of a raw egg white. It's kind of this gelatinous material. And they've shown in Dr. Pollack's lab that this does indeed form on the lining of the artery in chick embryos. And so there's some characteristics of structured water that make this very relevant to preventing clotting. So back in 1856, Rudolf Virchow, I talked about, said that clotting, and this still holds true in medicine today, clotting is caused by damage to the lining of the artery, when we get poor, stagnant blood flow, or when we get elements of blood that are too sticky, sticking together, and they're clumping things up, right? And so structured water, when it forms on the lining of the artery, one of its nicknames is exclusion zone water, because when it forms, nothing can penetrate it. No red blood cells, no lipoproteins, no albumin, which is the smallest protein in the blood. The only things that can penetrate it are very small hydrated ions of minerals, everything potassium or smaller. And so it forms this protective barrier. If we have intact structured water on the lining of the artery, it protects the lining of the artery from things that may damage it. So there's Rudolf or Virchow's first thing is that it protects the lining of the artery, prevents damage to the lining of the artery. The second thing is that when structured water forms, because of the way that it forms, it's very electronegatively charged. And since one of the ways that it forms is that it cleaves off one of the hydrogens, and the hydrogens are left beside the structured water. So the hydrogens are very positively charged. So that leaves a very electronegatively charged next to a positively charged area. And that's a battery, right? So that's what we know of as a battery. When we're trying to put a battery into something, we put the positive and negative charge somewhere because that's how a battery works. And they've actually shown that when you form structured water on a biological surface and you put electrodes into the negative, into the positive, and connect them to a light bulb, it powers the light bulb. The light bulb turns on. So it creates energy. And this energy in the blood vessels is used to move fluid. Okay, so they've done this in the lab. You put water in a tub, and you put a hydrophilic tube in the tub, and you put infrared light energy onto it, and the water starts flowing through the tube with no pump or anything acting on it. And so that's Virchow's.
Fascinating.
That's Virchow's triad number 2 is keep blood moving, keep it from being stagnant, right? So structured water does that. And the third thing is that structured water doesn't just form on the lining of the arteries, it forms on any biological surface, and that includes the elements of blood, the red blood cells, the lipoproteins, anything in the blood. And so because structured water has an electronegative charge, when structured water forms on a red blood cell, it creates this area of negative charge around it, makes the red blood cells negatively charged. And if two red blood cells are negatively charged, like charges don't like each other, they repel each other. So that keeps everything evenly spaced and not clumped together.
Makes a lot of sense.
In the blood.
Prevents clotting.
Right.
They don't want to stick together now.
Virchow's triad number 3 is keep elements of blood from sticking to each other. Keep the blood very fluid and less viscous, right? So we don't want viscous blood. So that's what structured water does. That's how we prevent clotting. And there's other ways you can prevent clotting.
Let me ask you a question. With structured water, when people listen to this, and myself included, you're talking about structured water being inside your body next to the loving surface. Does it also mean that drinking structured water has a direct effect on it, or that's two different elements? I just want to ask this question because a lot of times when you drink, for example, alkaline water, people say yes, but it doesn't mean that you're going to alkalize your body the same way just by drinking alkalized water. So I'm genuinely curious.
Yes. So you can't really drink structured water. You can drink energized water, because if you were drinking structured water, it'd be like you're drinking Jello, right? So you can't, because if it was truly structured. So, but you can do things that energize the water so that when you do drink it, it is becomes structured when it gets next to your biological surfaces
Like
because
ionizers?
no, so like so you basically want it to be toxin free because toxins can interfere with the structuring of water. You want it to be full of minerals, which is how the water in the cells is full of minerals. And you want it to be energized, and there's things you can do to energize it. Infrared light is the number one way to energize it, which makes sense because the sun is 42% infrared light. But also like swirling it around or swishing it around will energize it in the presence of oxygen, which makes sense again because water on Earth, that's what it's doing. It's moving. The water on Earth is not stagnant. It's flowing over rocks and rivers.
Right.
It's crashing on the beach and waves. The tides are moving it. It's evaporating and precipitating. It's moving all over the planet. Water is moving. And if we have stagnant water, it becomes dead water. Or if we're moving it through a laminar tube in a pipe, that's not really swishing it around. It's just moving it through. So it becomes very dead water. Um, and so that's how we create structured water. So adding minerals to it will alkalize the water. So that makes sense. But minerals are how we do that. We don't need fancy machines. I don't think we just need to mineralize the water and detoxify it, and then maybe swish it up a little bit. And there's
Got it.
various things that people can use to
Interesting
do
that
that.
even swishing around can
Mhm.
make a difference. So, guess what I'm gonna do next is, put a
Yeah.
little,
It's called
spoon there.
the oxytrophy of water, which people can look
Very
up into the
interesting.
research and see what that is. So yeah. So yeah, that's how we build structured water in our bodies. And so like, you know, for people who may be doubting this at this point, just like all the water in your body, like all the water in your cells is supposed to be in a gel-like state. It's supposed to be the structured water. And if you doubt that, just feel your tissue. That feels like a gel, right? That is not a liquid and it's not a solid. It gives and it bounces right back just like Jello would. Okay, so that's what most of the water in my body is. But there is some liquid water in the body, like in the blood and in the lymphatic fluid and the cerebral spinal fluid. But on the edges of that, in those vessels where it is, it's structured. And that's what moves this fluid. I mean, think about it. The lymphatic system doesn't
Hmm.
have a pump, quote unquote pump, which the heart
Right.
is not really a pump. But it moves nonetheless. And so does the cerebral spinal fluid. And this is how it does it.
It's so logical what you're saying. I think a lot of people are just not realizing how to put these things together to also tie it into clotting prevention because it makes sense that right there on the lining, you have that structured water gel-like substance that kind of like protects so the water can flow. And even if there's a little bit of a damage, that damage is kind of like protected by that gel. That's what you're saying, right?
Right, so that it can heal. And so that's
Right.
exactly what we see. So again, if people are still doubting this, in Pollack's lab, they found that infrared light builds structured water the best. And for, practitioners out there who know what heart failure is and how it works, we know that we see pooling up of fluid and we see a heart that's struggling to quote unquote pump, but that's not really the heart's job. What's happening is these breakdown of mechanisms in the periphery that are moving blood, and the heart is being forced to pump more than it's supposed to, resulting in changes in the size of the heart. And there's also other things too, like mitochondrial damage in the heart. Now, if you just go into PubMed and you type in infrared sauna and heart failure and just see the studies that come up, infrared sauna and heart failure, the research on it is just phenomenal. People who have heart failure and they start using infrared sauna therapy, getting infrared light on their skin, their heart goes back to normal size, their swelling goes down, their ejection fractions go up. Some people, get completely cured of it. So these mechanisms make sense and we have literature that backs up that. I mean, there's many ways that water can get energized, but infrared is just the way it does it the most. And that's what the research shows. Based on how much literature there is, it's very robust. I'm, shocked that there's no infrared saunas in every cardiac rehab center everywhere in the world.
Right. How many
I
of
mean,
them do you see in a typical MD office? Not too many, right?
yeah,
You see it upstairs at Polish Mike's house because we have
yeah.
one. But I didn't know it can have such a profound effect on heart health
Mm.
as well. It makes me, want to jump in,
Yeah,
So
definitely.
this
So
is
it's very interesting.
thanks for explaining this because I think it's important for people to know the context for the practical tips to make sense because a lot of things that you mentioned in terms of like I want you to do X, Y, and Z, and there are or like that's what I'm doing, and do what you want with the information. Where you are doing that, I think if people understand the mechanisms why certain things are forming, And also, what is the because one thing is preventing the clotting, and I know there are so many rabbit holes here. Another thing is like what actually causes, the lining to have these, micro cuts or micro tears, which you mentioned, both toxicity, insulin resistance, metabolic inflexibility or health problems, diabetes, etc., inflammation. I think that all of these things need to be combined in actionable steps for people so they don't go crazy and just now hack their body 24/7. So it's like no time for sleep because I got to hack my body 24/7. But at the same time, how about we just have a couple of things that really move the needle? Feel free to explain in layman's terms and also sometimes go deep because we have a lot of doctors watching and I want them to understand, in case they're doubting, where is the research to back it up as well.
Yeah. So from a really 10,000 foot view of this, the reason this makes sense is because life is all about energy, right? So the universe abides by the laws of thermodynamics of energy. And those two laws are that energy is not created or destroyed. It's just transferred between entities, right? And that things tend toward disorder. So when energy becomes concentrated, the universe likes to break it up. So in that sense, what life is that life has figured out how to temporarily defy the second law and create order that is life, that we know of as life, that somehow comes together into this thing, this animate thing that we have that has a consciousness, is aware of itself, and it's crazy, right? But that's what life is. And if we start to lose the ability to hold on to that energy, we start to get disorder. And disorder we know as disease, and it can manifest itself in different ways depending on which tissue is vulnerable. But energy is what we need to get into our bodies, right? And so what holds our energy, which our bodies are a net negative charge. Okay. So that's every physician out there who's gone through any type of training in cellular physiology knows that the cells hold a net negative charge, that voltage. And that voltage is what allows us to have certain things happen in the body, certain, they call it an action potential that happens. And so that negative charge, remember I told people that structured water is a net negative charge, the way that it forms. So it is what holds our charge. Okay. So that is what we need to build into our body. And we do that by gaining energy from our environment. So people think that we get all of our energy from food, but we get it in many other ways. We get electrons in many other ways. And so what we need to do is put ourselves in an environment that we can gather energy because our body is very well adapted to gathering energy. So all of the energy from the earth or on the earth comes from the sun. Everything that's stored in food comes from the sun. Everything that's concentrated into the earth comes from the sun. Everything that when our body harvests light from the sun, we make it into energy. We make it into electrons. And so that's what the goal of health should be, is to increase your net negative charge and hold on to that energy. Because when we get inflammation, like when people start looking at their blood markers and they see, oh, we have high C-reactive protein or high just various markers of inflammation, IL-6 and all these different things. It's because your negative charge is become more positive. Your pH has changed, right? So pH, we're looking at how much protons are present, right? If you're more acidic, you have more protons. If you're more basic, you have more alkalinity. You have more electrons. And we all know that the body, anybody who's familiar with cellular physiology knows that we function better at that net negative charge. It's like, 7.25 to 7.45, somewhere in there. And that equates to a voltage of about negative 20 to negative 25 millivolts. And so we need that voltage. We need that net negative energy. So we can get that in various ways. We can get that from eating food. We can harvest the chemical bonds in food and gain electrons from them and use them to build up the structured water in our bodies. And it's more efficient to do that through fatty acids, I think, because we make less of an exhaust, I'd say, when we do that. And we get more energy, more electrons per unit of fatty acids. So I think that burning fat is much more efficient than burning processed carbohydrates, which again makes sense historically, because historically, carbohydrate foods would have only been available one time a year, which is when fruit was in season. So most of the rest of the time of year we were eating animals, and lower carb foods. So we can do it that way. But we can also take energy directly from sunlight. So we have mechanisms. One of them is the molecule DHA, which is a fatty acid that we find in like seafood, and animal foods in general, which is why animal foods again are important. When that is in the skin, sunlight hits DHA, and DHA can turn sunlight into electrons directly into DC electrical current. And then also we have melanin, which people mostly know as the thing that tells us what color our skin is. We have
Hmm.
more or less melanin depending on the tone of our skin. And people think it's what protects us from the sun, but it's actually what absorbs the sun. Um, so,
Interesting.
uh, right. So it
So are you
absorbs the
absorbing
sun.
more sun after long-term sun exposure because now your body has more melanin and now you can actually absorb more? Because
Right.
a
Your
lot of people
body,
think that that's blocking the sun.
right.
So it's very interesting what you're saying.
So like if you don't have enough melanin, the sun can damage you, which goes to show people at higher latitudes usually have lighter skin, unless they're Eskimos and the sun's being reflected off the snow so much that they
Right.
have to have darker skin. But your body increases the melanin production because it's seeing all the sunlight, and A, it's trying to harvest energy from it. And B, it seems like it's protecting you from the sun because it's trying to convert it to electricity rather than the sun damaging the skin, which that's a whole nother conversation. The sun is not what causes skin cancer. But yeah, so that's one other mechanism. The other is so melanin takes that energy and what it uses it to dissociate water in the body. And so when it dissociates water, it creates hydrogen, oxygen, and electrons in the process. It creates 4 electrons every 2 molecules of water it dissociates. And so it dissociates and then the water reassociates but leaves the electrons. So we're harvesting energy from water right there using melanin.
So that's explaining why people who are dehydrated have less energy.
Yeah, exactly. And so like plants have chloroplasts, we have melanin. This just does the same thing for us that it does for plants. And so then the third thing is being in contact with the earth, direct contact with the earth. So the sun is concentrating energy into the ionosphere. And the ionosphere gets excited during a thunderstorm, and lightning strikes the earth. And lightning is depositing electrons into the earth, and that's happening like 1,000 times per second as we speak. And so that huge store of electrons in the earth can be conducted into us. We are a conductive surface, and the earth is a conductive surface. And the laws of electrostatics tell us that when two conductive surfaces touch each other, the area of higher concentration of energy will flow into the area of lower concentration. And I'm never going to be as concentrated as the earth. So it flows into me. And you can measure this with a voltage meter. You can measure your toes versus your head, and the electrons coming into your toes when your feet are on the earth, you're much more negatively charged there. And those electrons are, communicated or transported through the fascia system of our body into the cells. So there's many ways that we can gain these electrons and gain our charge. And that's exactly what research on grounding is showing, is that we're gaining charge. And I talked about the electrical charge around red blood cells. And there's direct literature evidence that grounding increases what they call the zeta potential, the charge around the red blood cells. So if you're talking about preventing clotting, that's huge. And so all of these things kind of make sense because humans didn't used to live indoors. I come from an evolutionary perspective. That means that humans have been around for about 300,000 years. And then life before that was around even longer, way longer. And these mechanisms are what, gave life its energy. We were always outside getting sunlight. We were always in contact with the earth. We were eating, more fatty acids than carbohydrates. Not to say that carbohydrates are bad or anything. It's just that they were only available certain times. And that led to this ability of our bodies to hold energy and maintain order. And so when you study life and what it is, that's why it makes sense that any disease process is these mechanisms breaking down, or things getting in the way of these mechanisms of your body's ability to take that energy, store that net negative charge in structured water in your body, and prevent these disease processes from happening.
Makes a lot of sense. And you know what's also very optimistic for myself and I think for people listening and watching is that the things that you're talking about are not really rocket science. In concept, they're relatively simple. Actually, it comes down to getting the proper exposure to the energy source through, like you mentioned, you can do it through the food. And then I'm assuming that you have a few different tips that you can do in that category. Then the sunlight exposure. I'm very interested in knowing what type of sunlight exposure you're talking about, like the noon
Mm.
versus, the long versus short. There are some questions there. And also you mentioned the last one, grounding, which also makes a lot of sense. Many people talk about it. And sometimes with these, that's the part where I don't like that about healthcare is when the money creeps in. Now it becomes, it's so easy to just put a label on a uh, infrared light therapy. Yeah, because they're trying to make money. Grounding mats. Yeah, they just want to sell mats. But people listen. There is a reason behind it, and the fact that somebody is using something good for the wrong purpose, that has nothing to do with the fact that it's good. So I wanted to ask you to give our viewers and listeners a few tips on each one of these categories, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Food, sunlight exposure, and then grounding or connection to earth.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so as far as food goes, I am a huge fan of eating local and in season. I think that is typically best. And so that's going to be, so what you can eat is going to depend on where you live, pretty much, and what grows there. I do think that the light stored in food is relevant to our bodies when we eat it. And if we are eating food that is not local or in season, we're getting a totally different light information than our body is outside, and that creates confusion. And there's even some evidence that improper light signaling or confusing light signaling is leading to dysfunction, things like autoimmunity um, in the body. So I do think that local and in season. So that means that A, we shouldn't eat the same thing year round. So here in a few months, there's going to be vegetables available at the farmer's market, and I'm going to start eating them, right? As long as I can get it from an organic producer, and various other things. I don't usually do much fruit, but I would because I'm type 1 diabetic, and it's just easier for me to control blood sugars if I don't do much carbohydrate. But I would if when it was in season and it was local. But that also means that large portions of the year, I'm pretty much eating animal foods which makes sense because if I was living out in the woods, that would be all that was available to me in the winter, was to eat those things. So that's kind of how I see diet. Like when you look at diet, there's all these dogmatic ways of viewing it. You could do, low carb all the time, or carnivore, or vegan, or paleo, or whatever. And all of them are, philosophically different, I guess. But in reality, we wouldn't have been choosing a dogmatic way of eating. We would have been eating what nature provided to us in the season. I think that matches up as best we can to do things that way. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has to do that to achieve a good level of health, but that's my general recommendation. And then as far as nutrients, like when you look at your food, you want it to provide you with some energy and nutrients. So energy could be fat or carbohydrates, which interestingly, there's really no food in nature that has both or high amounts of both. It's usually one or the other. So if you look at modern processed foods, they're usually high in fat and carbohydrate, which is a problem. The only food that's like that is breast milk, which is for a baby and it's designed for a quick weight gain for a baby, right? So that's something to think about. And then you want nutrients, which are protein, vitamins, and minerals. So if you look at foods that give us energy and very bioavailable, meaning we can absorb it very well, proteins, vitamins, and minerals, it's animal foods. That's what seems to be the best as far as suiting our digestion. We are not a cow. We are not a gorilla. We cannot extract all those different nutrients and proteins from plants like they can. We have a different digestive system. And so that's what seems to be the best for us as far as those needs that we need to get met. As far as light, ideally, we want to get various forms of light throughout the day from the sun. Because that light information, which is something we haven't got into, is circadian rhythm. It drives our circadian rhythm and communicates to our body what time of day it is, what season it is. And that is information. And light, you have to see light as information. Just like a cell phone and a wireless signal is sending off a wireless signal, that is light. It's on that wireless signal is on the electromagnetic spectrum, just like visible light is. And we know that that cell phone can carry information to another cell phone, and I can communicate to you wherever you are on the planet, pretty much. So light is information. And the only information of light that humans got historically was from the sun. And so we want to sync our bodies up to the day-night cycle. And we want to get sunrise light, and we want to get mid-morning light, which is UVA. UVA comes out, and we want to get some UVB light in the midday, and we want to try and see evening light. And so tell your body what time it is, but then most importantly, we want to block blue light after sunset. And blue light is in our environments a lot these days with screens and TVs and cell phones and LED lights and fluorescent lights. Like when you have those on after sunset, you're telling your body that it's noon. And that is completely throwing off its biological rhythm. That's giving it the wrong information. And if you just go into PubMed and you type in disrupted circadian rhythm or blue light exposure and pick whatever disease you want, there is research that shows that it's affecting this. And I would even argue that it's driving things like metabolic disorders and breast cancer. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that. So you want to get out there, you want to get light exposure. Obviously, burning is not fun. There's really no evidence, in my opinion, that the sun causes cancer. I can show you studies that show that people have less rates of melanoma the more UVB exposure they get. And also, people who already have melanoma die less frequently the more UVB they get. So there are studies like that out there, and just logically, it doesn't make sense. Skin cancer rates have increased recently, not been around forever, and the sun has been around forever. So it must be something else. It must be some other change that's driving that from happening. Now, the sun can burn you, and it's not fun, but you are less likely to burn if you have adequate amounts of DHA, animal food, fatty acid, DHA, because you'll take that sunlight and you'll convert it. Whereas if you're eating more vegetable oils and things like that, then you're probably more likely to burn. But also, if you tell your body what time it is throughout the seasons and throughout the day and prepare it for the more intense light in the summer and at midday, then it's going to be ready to take that on and increase mechanisms that utilize the sunlight rather than let it burn you. So I don't think that's important, but it also depends on your skin tone. Obviously, I'm a very white person. I'm very pale. My family is from Northern Europe and my ancestors, and so they had whiter skin, trying to let more sunlight in. Whereas if your ancestors are from more the equator, you're going to have darker skin because your body was the bodies were trying to absorb sunlight through melanin. So all that's interesting, but using the sunlight as a resource is very, very helpful. And then obviously there's ways that we can kind of biohack that today, and we can use infrared saunas or red light panels. Those things are useful. And then blocking the blue light using incandescent bulbs,
which are very hard to get now.
Hard to get now, yeah. After sunset, or wearing blue blocking glasses that allow you to be functional, turning down the blue light on your screens and things like that. In the evenings when the sun has gone down, that's critically important. And then as far as grounding, the most common question I get is, how long do I have to do it for it shows benefit? And there's really no minimum amount. Like any amount you can do is beneficial, but the longer the better, obviously. Ideally, to give people some context. So in a study, or not a study, it was an experiment done by one person. They took like a sample of the red blood cells and looked at it on a petri dish, and they showed that the red blood cells were clumped together, looked like stacked up pancakes. We call that a rouleau formation. And then they went and grounded for, I think it was 30 minutes, and the red blood cells were all evenly spaced after we took their blood after that.
30 minutes.
Yeah, 30 minutes.
And what was the means for which they were grounding? Was it more like a grounding mat type of a connection, or was it actually on the ground?
For this, what I'm talking about here, it was one person and they were directly on the earth. But there is a study where they used grounding mats indoors and had a similar effect. I'm not sure of the timing though. But then they did it again, I think 10 minutes after they stopped grounding, and it was still fairly well spaced apart.
Yeah, that was my next question. How long does it actually last? Because that would also indicate how often we should do it.
Right. And then an hour after they stopped grounding, it was starting to clump up again. However, we have to take into context that I don't know what environment that person went back into. Right? Did they go into an environment that was artificial light? That was like, how healthy was the person in general?
Yeah. Plus, with a sample of one, it's really hard to have a good conclusion there. But it's still very interesting to see that there are some results which cannot be further evaluated if somebody would like to sponsor more studies on this.
Right. Yeah. And so I guess the moral of the story is just, go outside and put your feet on the earth as often as you can. And that's always going to be best, especially standing in sunlight. That's going to be amazing. That's how our body gains energy. But then for times that you can't be doing that, you can use indoor grounding devices. So grounding mats or grounding sheets can be useful. You just want to make sure, well, first you got to make sure that you have a grounding wire in your home, because some older homes don't have a grounding wire. They may have a three-prong plate on there, but they only have a 2-hour system. Because it's lots of the newer plugs are three-pronged, and so they have to put the three-prong, but they never install the grounding wire. It wasn't there originally. So you have to make sure you have a grounding wire. And you also have to make sure, be cautious of like dirty electricity. If there's crossed wires or dirty electricity in the walls, that can be brought in sometimes. And there's ways you can test for that. But yeah, otherwise, you can use these grounding devices that plug into the grounding prong of your outlet. Like my feet are on a grounding mat right now. And I have grounding sheets that I sleep on. So, it's probably not near as effective as your feet directly on the earth, but it's, something I wouldn't be getting if I didn't have them. So it's a way that we can kind of reconnect that way. And people make grounding mouse pads, like you have your
Hmm.
hand on it, it's just lots of different ways. Or people make grounding shoes that have a little metal on the bottom of them that connects up to you, so that you ground that way. If you're hiking or something like that. So there's lots of different ways, there are products that people use that you can use, but it's always free if you just go outside and if you can put your feet on the earth.
I love it. And it's so practical. The things that you're talking about are not really rocket science. Then they don't require me to spend 100,000 in all the biohacks, which I'm actually part of the tribe here. And I don't mind spending a good amount of money, maybe not 100 grand, at least not right away. But this is something that you're talking about that is practical, can move people in the right direction. And that's what I was looking for in the whole environment where you have people complaining about the healthcare system being wrong. Sure, we can improve a lot there, but there's a lot of optimism because not only there are amazing people who are really teaming up together to spread the information, and you're part of that tribe and you're leading that tribe when it comes to heart health. And I love that. I see the amount of respect you get from medical doctors, which sometimes they would say, well, why would somebody who was not trained as a cardiologist is going to tell me something about heart health? Well, interestingly enough, it's not the letters after somebody's name, but a lot of experience and what they actually invested in getting the information, the source of the information, and also the ability to synthesize information. And I found this to be very fascinating how effective you are with delivering these messages online. And I do want people to be able to easily connect with you because out of this conversation, I can already identify probably 45 different, rabbit holes that I would like to dig a little bit deeper and ask you more questions. Um, where can people find you online that they can dig a little bit deeper, ask you a question? And if you coach people, I would like you to also give them a good entry point. What is the best way to connect with you?
Yeah, so my website is resourceyourhealth.com. People can reach out to me through the contact there, or they can set up a initial consult with me, which is just a free 15 minutes to discuss what's going on and if I can help them. They can do all that through the website. I also have certain recommended products up there people can look at. My books are on there. I have 2 books right now and a third one coming, which are Understanding the Heart and The Health Evolution. And then so my website's the main place. People can also find me on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and X, I guess it's called now. Just Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey. And that's where people can find me. My books are also available on Amazon, but if people don't want to use Amazon, they can go to the publisher's website, for the Heart book, which is Chelsea Green Publishing.
Amazing. Our group, you have different type of people watching this or listening to this. If there is a healthcare practitioner who would like to help out, how can we as a group, how can we help you? How can we support you? What is it that you need that you would find relevant?
Honestly, spread the information. Like, don't keep this information to yourself. If you want to dive deeper into it, then there's like in the back of my book, I recommend all these, different books you can read and get into it and like master the information, but spread it because the more people that know it, the more we're going to affect people's health. And ultimately, like we talk about, I don't believe that healthcare reform is going to come from top down. If we want to change healthcare, we have to affect healthcare's bottom line, which means we have to get enough people to opt out and take back control of their health. And that is something that practitioners can do. We can educate people on how to do that and to opt out of that system as much as possible so that we stop feeding it so much so that we take away its power and we make it change. Just like if we all decided that we hate a certain way that McDonald's does something and we say we're not going to go there anymore, or we're not going to, definitely not going to buy that product anymore. We hate the way they, I don't know, cook their burgers or something, which I guess I do. And people decide we're not going to, McDonald's would change the way they cook their burgers to stay in business, right? So we need to do that with healthcare. We need to show healthcare that we want something different. So I guess what I would ask from practitioners or even just people that have other people in their lives, spread this information. Let's get people healthier so that we can start to shift it from a grassroots perspective. Because I just don't believe it's going to happen when pharmaceutical companies just wake up one day and be like, oh, you know what we're doing is wrong and we're going to change. That's not going to happen. So
give me a probability guess for that one.
Yeah, right. It's 0, unless we force it to. And I think that we can. It's hard, and some people may be more negative or less optimistic than I am. But I think that when people are told the truth, and they are given information that helps them, they'll share it. And so that's what I ask people to do: is share it and help other people.
That is amazing. And talking about grassroots, from grounding and then heart attack, and I'm trying to picture I'm a visual guy, so I'm trying to picture in my mind where people have a heart attack and there is a problem with the heart that basically somebody needs to be brought back to life. What do? They resuscitate, and they also like shock the body with energy. Why is today we learned a lot from you that it's all about energy. It's all about from that structure water and then these molecules that we have in our body and the grounding, and then we are really one big batteries. And I'm thinking about everything is about that negative charge or that charge. It's not just that charge. We are in charge. We are in charge of our body. We're in charge of what we're going to do next. And I want to thank you for joining us. It's a very valuable information interview. I really love that. I want to thank you for watching or listening. Till next time, and I'm going to be referring patients to you, providers to you, because you're amazing. Seriously, big thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.